Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. This is a session on finding, translating, and publishing stories from Africa, Asia, and Turkey. And we're going to be talking about how we discover content from non-European and often non-mainstream languages in parts of the world, then how we translate it, and finally how we publish it. And our panelists include a combination of agents, publishers, and translators. Some people are more than one. And so we'll be talking about all these steps. Very quickly, to introduce our panel, to my immediate left is Gabriella Pagefort. What's your official title? Editorial Senior Acquisitions Editor at Amazon Crossing. To her left, we have Yulang Li, who is the founding editor of Asymptote. To Yulang Li's left, we have Amy Spangler, who is the head of Anatolia Lit, agent representing Turkish literature, also selling things into Turkish as well, aren't you? And Amy herself translates brilliantly from Turkish to English. On Amy's left, we have Roland Glasser, who translates from the French, and this year has been basically shortlisted for every possible translation award. And if I were to list them, we would be out of time and have no Q&A. So, and to Roland's left, we have Nicky Harman, who translates from Chinese to English and is also on the editorial board of Paper Republic, the excellent journal of Chinese literature translated into English. So, to start at the beginning, we're going to talk about how we find and identify content. Obviously, you're bringing work from other languages, other countries, other regions, other literary traditions, to bring that into English. Nicky, what is the process like at Paper Republic? What kind of challenge and what kind of challenges and how have you operated?
A bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. I mean, China has vast numbers of writers, thousands registered with the Chinese Writers Association, and many more thousands who are not. We do it. It's a sort of process where hopefully you find something happily falls into your hand and you like it. Some of it, a lot of it is doing the groundwork, like reading literary journals. Reading stuff that's available online, getting to know new authors' work that way. Literary journals from China include Pathlight, which is already in translation and is published in Beijing. Hutzpah was a wonderful bilingual magazine run by a Chinese cultural activist. Other literary journals available in Chinese. I have to say most of them have to be available online. If they're not, it's very hard to actually get hold of them. You really don't want to lug all these journals around. Then there's obviously translation journals like Words Without Borders and Asymptote. Not to be forgotten is the importance of personal recommendations. I always ask writers what other writers they like. Professors, literary critics, anyone I can get hold of. People on trains, they almost always say they don't read anymore, which is literary agents in China. You just try to gather as much knowledge, as many names as you can, and get a flavour for what new writers there are. And then we all read them. Having read them, then we decide what we like.
Okay. And Nicky, of course, Paper Republic translates from Chinese only into English. Yulang, you're doing all languages. What kind of challenges, or again, you have people all over the world working as your consulting editors.
Right.
How do you all work together?
I just want to say a few words about Asymptote for those who don't know about our magazine yet. Our mission is to catalyze the transmission of world literature, and we basically operate as a magazine, and we've put out quarterly issues at first, but now we've evolved into a series of platforms that have included a daily blog, fortnightly emails, and monthly podcasts, all in the service of pushing out the great local literature that we find everywhere into the world. Now, we are a team of 70 over editors at large, and other people working to market the literature that we have, graphic designers, even video producers. We actually produce video trailers for every issue that we put out. So a large part of what we do is transmitting the literature, disseminating it as widely as possible. But also there's a lot of us involved in the process of finding the great literature that's around the world, securing the permissions. We also have to approach the authors, find the translators, commission the translations, and edit it so that it's up to scratch for publication. All right. So how we've managed to secure the literature that we produce is through this vast network of editors at large. In 6 continents and over 20 countries, we have editors at large, all of them with their fingers on the pulses of their local literature scenes. And we work with those gatekeepers. For example, I brought some materials here for show and tell. This is a leading magazine in Taiwan. I'm not Taiwanese. I moved to Taiwan only in 2012, but I've discovered that it's a great source of Chinese literature. And so, for example, this magazine that I'm holding up here is called Unitas. And like Granta in London, in the UK, and like the New Yorker in the US, they've started putting out a list of 20 under 40 of 20 best young writers under the age of 40. So because I'm in Taiwan, I'm walking to a bookshop, I see this, and I can actually look at all the 20 essays introducing all the 20 writers from Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, and Malaysia. I'm like, okay, wouldn't this be great if it made it into English, and if all the rest of the world could know what was happening in the Chinese literary scene beyond Mo Yan, the Nobel Prize winner in 2012, beyond those books that are coming out in the bookshops. So being there in Taiwan, I was able to meet with the editor of Unitas, basically get the rights to translate the magazine, the articles that make up these 20 under 40, and secure the permission to publish it in the magazine. And this came out in May 2012, and we published 10 essays in July 2012, and the other 10 in October 2012. So that's like 5 months of turnaround time for 20 medium-length essays that we found in this magazine while I just happened to be walking to a bookshop there. So to answer your question and to summarize very briefly, being there is definitely the best thing. You're there, you're inserted into the literary scene. You can go to literary festivals, you can provide dispatches, and you can let people there know about Asymptote as a way to introduce translated literature to the English-speaking world, as well as ask them for their permission to translate their work and to publish their work in our magazine.
Okay. Leong and Nicky, you're both doing literary journals. Gabby, how does it work for you doing books? What you must have some things in common. How else do you find your content?
Amazon Crossing is looking for novels that have distinguished themselves at home and also in translation in other markets. Thank you, yeah. And if you come here, it's actually pretty obvious that Europe is really readily available. There's a lot of agents and foreign publishers who are scheduling meetings with me and other people like me, and it's very easy for us to get a sense of the bestsellers, get a sense of the recent literary prize winners, and that shopping source is actually pretty straightforward. We review catalogs and we talk to people and we choose the books that seem like they'll have the best success rate in our market. For countries beyond Europe, it's actually quite a bit harder. Even in Latin America, which seems like it should be really accessible to the U.S., and even in some of these marketplaces that are closer to Europe, there are fewer people who have established agencies and who have established foreign rights selling processes who have reached out to me or who I've found. So a big part of my challenge is actually finding individuals who I can trust and who I can meet with or communicate with regularly so I can help them understand what works well for us in our marketplace, which of course is always based on the last 6 months worth of results, which is not necessarily predictive. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is meet people who I can relate to, who have their finger on the pulse, just like with the literary magazines, but maybe a little bit less experimental and more on the more mainstream pulse. Books that everyone is talking about, books that people are buying. There's a Publishing Trends regular bestseller list from around the world spotlight that helps to show this is the top 10 bestsellers, including translated titles in different marketplaces. And that's really exciting for me because it'll spotlight India one time and it'll spotlight China another time, and beyond the realm of what I can reach with my own language skills or with Google Translate and serendipity, I can get a little bit of insight into what's going on in other marketplaces. But a lot of it is just about who I've met so far. So we've only been around about 6 years, which means I've only met so many people. Amy's a great example. She's one of my great sources for Turkish literature. We met at a book fair, and we meet regularly at the book fair, and every time we meet, it gets easier to work together. And I think that's an example of sort of how important this community is, and then also each of the connections that broaden this community. So each of you has your contacts in your local language or in the languages that you read. You have your own personal ideas and tastes about what might be a good idea for translation, and we rely on you and everything beyond you to sort of discover things. And Amazon Crossing recently launched a website where anyone can submit a title for consideration, whether you hold the rights or not. It's an opportunity for people who have read a book and loved it to just go online and transmit that book for consideration. And I encourage everyone to consider doing that, especially for a story that you think has really broad appeal for any reason in the fiction category.
Amy, do you want to talk about the agent's role in how publishers find content?
I imagine a lot of people here kind of know about that, but I think, just to add on to maybe what Gabby said, it's really about building relationships, I think, over a certain amount of time, building this kind of trust and an understanding of the tastes of the editors and, what we have to offer, and trying to bring those together, and really each of us trying to keep kind of a finger on the pulse of our own markets. I might speak a little bit, to the difficulties. I think dealing in Turkish, of course, a major difficulty is just being able to produce material that publishers and acquiring editors can read. So translation, it's all about translation, right? That's why we're here. And so for the agent as well, that's the biggest hurdle. There's actually not even, I would say, a huge pool of translators for Turkish to English. And so that's a major issue. I would say another, just something I would mention in terms of being able to sell more into English. That's a form of resistance we see more in English maybe than in other languages, is also a resistance to try out new translators as well, and work with, so maybe, which I can understand, because I've seen a lot of heartbreak, editors experience a lot of heartbreak and frustration when trying to work with, new translators, and it doesn't work out. But a lot of times, they just want to, it's kind of the standard translators that they always work with. And so I think that when you're working in these languages, you necessarily have to try and coordinate more with also translators and publishers as well, and introduce them. So it's not, in other languages you might, because the publisher has a French translator and a German translator and a Spanish translator. You just got to show them the book. For us, a lot of times we got to show them the book and the translator. And that may be the case for other languages represented here as well, like Chinese. I don't know. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yep. Roland, do you want to talk about, again, picking up on Amy's comment about new translators? When publishers are looking for translators, obviously there are there are more available for some languages, obviously, than for others. How has the Emerging Translators Network worked toward that, would you say?
Well, first, for anyone who doesn't know, the Emerging Translators Network was set up several years ago by 3 young emerging translators. Rosalind Harvey, who's sitting here in the pink, who translates from Spanish, Anna Holmwood, who translates from Swedish and Chinese, and Jamie Lee Searle, who translates from German. And it was set up because although all 3 were members of the Translators Association, there was a lack of kind of resources and networking possibilities for people coming into the profession, wanting to enter the profession, needing a place to exchange questions and tips and advice and so on and so forth. So the Emerging Translators Network functions mainly as a Google group. We have about 700 plus members, mostly in the UK, mostly translating into English, some translating out of English, quite a few based elsewhere in the world, and covering a very wide range of languages. Where it can be useful, I think, is certainly for publishers, for example, is if they're looking for a translator, perhaps in a less widely spoken language, so not French, German, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Polish, Chinese, other languages, Slovenian, Lithuanian, Czech, Bengali, the list goes on. And so that can kind of be a useful resource to contact the ETN and see if we have anyone who works perhaps in those combinations. Or sometimes people who are members know other people who aren't members of the network but could be useful. Yeah.
I think obviously one of the problems for publishers of these non-European and less well-known languages and cultures is that so much. It's the question of finding the new generation of translators, which the Emerging Translators Network, and it's a parallel in the U.S., are very much working to address. But there's also the question of how translators themselves are trained and mentored. Certainly, one of the great pleasures of being in translation publishing for the 4 billion years that I have been is that we've really seen a development in the last generation of a movement of presenting these literatures and languages from more of an academic, almost an anthropological approach, and really bringing translators along now who not only know a language and know the culture and the content, but can also produce the work in beautiful English. So really introducing that very strong literary quality. Nicky, you've worked in mentorship. You've mentored younger Chinese translators.
Yes. On Paper Republic has a short story series where we're publishing a short story every Thursday for a year. I suppose we were quite surprised and extremely gratified that some new translators came to us with really very challenging stories. I happen to really enjoy mentoring new translators. So I've taken on a few of these, and it's been a very rewarding experience on both sides. As a result of one story successfully edited, discussed, and this can be over a period of weeks, even a couple of months. We're talking short stories, so a lot of work goes into it on both sides. They get published, and I know it's given them confidence to go on after that. I mean, that you could say is an informal kind of mentoring, but hugely important. Then Paper Republic and a project in Leeds University called Writing Chinese it has run now 2 translation competitions. Last year's winners went on to translate, I'm talking exclusively in this case from Chinese into English. They've gone on to translate both for Paper Republic and independently, and that's also been very gratifying. And I've actually done the most enjoyable co-translation project with last year's winner, where we worked really as equals. And what more can you hope for than to find someone who's really starting out but is already up there at a very high level. There are also mentoring schemes which and translation summer schools, which I'm involved in, the translation summer school at City University, which offers a number of different language combinations. So that'll be taking place in London in July this year in, I think, 7 different languages into English. And the British Centre for Literary Translation in Norwich also runs summer schools and mentoring programs. So there is a lot out there. I think that's all either UK-based or internet-based. Other people on the panel will have other experiences of mentoring.
I would also just add that there's, on ETN, on the TA forum in general, there's a lot of informal mentoring that goes on, whether regarding doing a translation itself, questions of translation, or the more business side, negotiating contracts, pitching books, so on, dealing with people who don't pay, all kinds of things. And I can certainly think of a number of people, a couple here who I've, helped in the past, to sort of, they've said, I'm negotiating this contract, what do you think? And I'm like, why don't you ask them this or that? Talking with a voice of great wisdom, which I don't necessarily have, but it's often easier to give advice and follow it yourself. But so there's a lot of that goes on, and these networks have helped. This is something that always has existed, but it's kind of helped it to sort of to carry on, to improve, to go further.
Amy, what's going on with training Turkish translators? I think you were recently involved in a workshop, weren't you?
Well, we have an annual workshop for translators of Turkish literature that we've had for 10 years now. I think it's the 11th. I'm looking at Ken here, who also participates in the same workshop. And that we have, it lasts between 10 and 14 days every year on Junda Island in the Aegean. And it's a wonderful location, I have to admit. But in this case, we choose one author and one poet, and the group is usually divided into 2, although some people come and go. And then we basically spend that time translating work by that author and that poet. And the author and the poet, if they're alive, also come and give a talk with us, or give a talk to us, and then also work with us. One interesting aspect of that is we found that it's probably just as eye-opening for the author as it is for the translators, if not even more so, to see what it means to be translated, and also to have to think about why they wrote what they wrote. When you say, so what did you mean when you said that? Well, I'm not sure. So that's been great, and so a lot of people return each year, or we'll come back every other year, and we try to integrate 1 or 2 new people each year, and so. Yeah, that's been great, and that's funded by the Turkish Ministry of Culture as part of their TEDA project, and also kind of sponsored by Boğaziçi University. So, that's been a pretty fabulous project, I think, and I think also important in a way, which I think what we're touching on here is a kind of a gatekeeper and a kind of stamp of approval that translators who work with or mentored by, anybody who's worked with Roland now will have a stamp of approval. If he says, you can work with this person and trust them, then they're good to go, which is very important, I think, for the publishers who have no idea, and especially if you don't know the source language at all, you need to have someone you can trust to say they have my stamp of approval. And so I think the workshops work in a similar fashion.
And there's also a kind of a curious way in which it doesn't just work to the benefit of the person who is recommended by the more senior person, as it were, if you can follow that. But for example, just if someone asks me to do some work and I don't have time to do it, it's good that I can have several people who I can trust to pass work on to that client, to that publisher, and that's also a way in which I don't myself lose that client because they don't have to then go and find someone. I've recommended someone to them personally, and so that also helps me in terms of my relationship with that client and that publisher.
Right. Leong, do many of your 70 editors at large also work with translators? Do they also bring translators when they're recommending projects?
Well, we don't have 70 editors at large. We have
sorry.
70 team members, but maybe 20 of them are editors at large.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
The sheer number of your staffers had me so dazzled that I just completely lost control.
In fact, I'm looking forward to meeting some of the new team members tonight for the first time, because we work online, collaborate digitally, but we actually haven't met in person, face to face, for many of us. Well, we don't have mentoring schemes at Asymptote, but we do very much believe in encouraging emerging translators. We've held 2 translation competitions. The second one we'll be announcing the winners this Friday on the release of our April issue. And this contest would be giving away $1,000 to the first prize winner and $500 to a runner-up in 3 categories: fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. And they're each judged by Michael Hoffman for poetry, Ottilie Mauset, winner of a Best Translated Book Award, that she'll be judging fiction, and we have Margaret Jewel Costa judging the non-fiction. So we believe in not only giving material encouragement for translators to stay and thrive in their newly chosen line of work, but I've arranged for The Guardian to publish the winning entries in the upcoming 3 Tuesdays. We currently have a partnership with The Guardian, whereby I personally select and run a piece, a newly translated short story or a poem every Tuesday. So they've agreed to showcase these contest winners, and I think that sort of visibility and that sort of promotion is invaluable, and it can give them a great boost in their careers. We also have a lot of contact because we have regular submissions through the transom. So, for example, if I see a promising work by a translator, I'll often exchange notes and say, maybe this is not working, but maybe something else down the road, and so on and so forth. We've published a lot of first-time translators as well, and there's a lot of editing back and forths. Sometimes they're resistant to the editing process, which is a pity, and the story doesn't get published in the end. But a lot of times they're very amenable, very very receptive to the edits that we propose, and those are the ones that we are very very happy to showcase on the journal as well.
So, Gabby, say you've identified your content, you've lined up a translator, you have your final manuscript, you're ready to publish. What kind of considerations go into presenting a translation of a work from this lesser-known part of the world, these less commonly known languages? What kind of considerations go into as you position a book for publication?
That's a hard question. I think it depends on the book. I think a lot of books you sell based on the story. So it doesn't matter where it came from or why it came. The point is that this is a story that I think you'll like. And the reason I think you'll like it is either it compares to these other stories, either by genre or by style. I think that finding out from an author who they admire writing in English and who they admire who's known on the world stage can be incredibly helpful, because then you can help present those comparable books and know that you're not misrepresenting the author when you do so. And then sometimes you can actually end up working with both of those authors. For example, Laura Esquivel is considered an example by many Spanish authors and Mexican writers as someone they admire and look up to. And now we have her on our list. And when we talk to new writers, that actually really helps us not only to work well with them publishing and selling their book, but also to bring bigger names and larger projects into the fold. And I think when we position books for customers and for readers, we only have so much control over what their perception is. We have the cover, we have promotional text, we have the author's biography and the photograph of the author, and that's pretty much it. We might have some review quotes from other publications when the book was published in other languages. But for the most part, we're trying to present an honest picture of what is this book. So if this book is very much about the Chinese experience, and it's very much about a time in history and a conflict that people in our market might not be familiar with, it's partially our responsibility to show that in the visuals and to explain that somehow quickly in a paragraph that's easy and fun to read and makes you want to read a whole novel about it. So it's quite hard, and oftentimes the author will disagree with us about how to do that, because from a local perspective, hey, that's boring, that's just the context, that's not what people are going to buy this book for. Or it's the other way around. People will want to buy this book because it's exotic, so we need to show how exotic it is. And then it's often my job to say, actually, this is a love story. Anyone can relate to this love story. We need people to understand what the context is of the love story so that they can feel why this book is special. But we're going to get better results if what we put forward is a really wonderful package that feels like an accessible love story. So I think reading closely and bringing in the opinions of the translator, who often has a phenomenally helpful pitch and a lot of context about what they think readers need to know about the cultural context, if anything. The agents are often very helpful as well. The original packaging helps us guide ourselves, and often that's why I chose the book, so it sort of carries through in some ways. And then we're also trying to adapt to our to adapt to the audience we're trying to appeal to, because everyone will benefit if the book is successful. So it's a combination of thinking about the end result and thinking about the book itself and everything that happened to bring it there, and attempting to create a coherent, simple, beautiful presentation that is honest to the work.
Nicky, how do you think about presenting the work that goes into Paper Republic? What kind of considerations go into how you're going to publish, or when you put together your issues?
It has to be really well written, and it has to be really well translated. You can't have you can't have one without the other. But since we started this project, we focused on the fact that getting a story online is actually only the first step. As Paper Republic then was quite small, although it's now much better known as a result of what we've been doing in the last year, we knew that we had to promote as much as simply putting it online. There's no point having it online if nobody knows it's there. So we've done a variety of things to choose a story for a particular week because something was topical. Sometimes we've had to move quite fast, as when the Chinese government suddenly abolished the requirement that families should only have one child. And we found a story which was actually not just very topical, but it was an essay, it was beautifully written, and it was really nicely translated. So a story about what it's like being something like the second girl in a family that longed for a boy, and the mother gets pregnant again. And this is a true story written by a really well-known writer. So we could make that. It happened to be ready, serendipity. So we put it out there, and it actually got, of all the stories we've put online in the last year, it claimed the most readers, which is really good. In other cases, we've planned far in advance, and we've got our readers that way. Like Chinese New Year, the Year of the Monkey, I happen to have a favorite translation of Journey to the West, also known as Monkey. And so we persuaded the translator, Bill Jenner, to write an essay on how he translated it, which was many years ago, when the atmosphere, the surroundings in which one translated was far more difficult. There were far fewer translators to talk to. There wasn't the internet, and so on. That essay was then published in a Los Angeles Review of Books, which was great. They were then pointed to the excerpt from the translation, which we posted on Paper Republic. And in turn, obviously, we pointed people to the LA Review of Books. So a whole variety of ways of choosing stories. Sometimes we just love them and we choose them anyway, but other times we really try to tie them to an event, to another publication, and so on.
Leong, and for you?
Well, I second what Nicky said. I think topicality is really important. I'll give you two examples. One piece that was brought to the table was by our Mexican editor-at-large, Sophie Hughes. Back then, at that point, a lot of people were talking in the media about the 43 disappeared students in Ayotzinapa, which is a small village in Mexico. And we had, I think she knew a poet called David Herta, who wrote this poem addressing this very urgent issue. And we decided to use our collective editorial brain power, and we presented it on the blog within 10 days of the poem's original publication in Spanish, and we presented it in 20 languages, from Chinese to Yiddish to Hebrew. And we also had recordings to accompany the translations. So that was one example of a project that was very close to our heart, because it actually brought attention to a very urgent social issue, a political issue, in fact. And it was very gratifying when there was even news about it in the papers. And even the school in Ayotzinapa, they got wind of this project. I think they were all very touched. Another project similar to this one was in 2013 in March, when we published a non-fiction written by Jonas Hassan Kameri. Basically, it was an open letter to a politician in Sweden, and it was all about racial profiling, and he's writing from the perspective of an immigrant writer, an immigrant living in Sweden, and this was actually the most tweeted non-fiction, the most tweeted article in Swedish history, and my Berlin-based editor brought it to my attention, and we published it in our April issue. And shortly after we published it, a lot of other media outlets, including the New York Times, began discussing this article. So having all these editors at large really helps to give us a constant stream of compelling content.
Another question that we always have as publishers is positioning work from that comes not only out of a different literary tradition, but also out of a different out of a different literary context, and the way that different literatures treat, say, novels as opposed to short stories. Roland, do you want to talk a little bit about that? About what?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did I wake you? No. I think so. Let me refocus the question. I get a do-over. Certainly, you translate from French, which encompasses such a large part of the world. But much of the French you translate is African French. How do the literary traditions there, or the concepts between, or how do say finding short stories as opposed to working on novels? What differences do you see?
I've not really worked on short stories from there. What's interesting about the literary traditions in Africa is that there are a lot of very strong oral traditions. Okay. You find that most people will speak several languages. So in countries that most of Africa was colonized, so most people either speak, colonized by sort of English-speaking or French-speaking, or I guess Dutch-speaking, a couple of German-speaking. So people may well speak one of those languages, but they will also speak at least one other language, possibly several other languages, because people grow up in families which may come from different ethnicities, and so the The Congolese author Fiston Mwanza-Mujila, who I translated, whose book Tram 83 I translated from French, also speaks Lingala, Swahili, and Wolof. So there's kind of already, you're in a kind of a multilingual situation. But what's interesting is that there isn't yet, it's beginning, but there isn't yet really much of a written literary tradition in any languages other than, I guess, the languages of the former colonizer, one might say. But it's not necessarily seen as a negative thing. It's kind of, it's kind of understood that if you're a writer, you're going to write in French because French is the language of literature. English is the language of literature. That is changing. I know that there's a novel in Lingala which is going to be published by Phony Media based in LA. I think it's the first, or one of the very first, African books not written in a European language to be published. The other thing is that there's different African writers will respond in their writing or treat in their writing the other languages and the other cultures in different ways. So in the case of Fiston's work in Tram 83, it's actually written in quite a high register of French. There's not really much slang. There are no words from other African languages except the odd reference to a dance style or something like that. So that was a relatively easy job from that point of view. There are other things in the novel which were complicated to translate. There are some African writers who will pepper their work with words from other languages, or they will use a lot of slang that's specific to their culture. Sometimes I believe they'll even use these kind of more obscure references and then maybe have footnotes or notes that explain it. So there are kind of the writers themselves, and obviously sometimes the translations. So there are kind of a whole range of sort of different approaches. But I think it's a very interesting time for African literature. I think that it's growing into a new phase, which I probably would find hard to define. But Tram 83 recently won this major African prize, the Etisalat Prize for Literature, which is awarded to a first novel, an African first novel. The prize has only been going 3 or 4 years. And as in the case of a lot of literary prizes anywhere in the world, the sort of people who set them up kind of, it's a Nigerian prize, so they set up this prize, and it kind of seemed, I guess, obvious to them that, well, we're in Nigeria, English is the language, so a first novel is obviously going to be written in English because people write in English, right? So the US publisher Deep Vellum of Tram 83 had to persuade them more or less forcefully, depending on the version one believes, to accept a work of translation for this prize. And so the fact that it won the prize, beating 2 South African novels, that are written in English, is really a major first for African literature. And the responses from, after the prize was announced, I get all these sort of obscure friend requests on Facebook from random African writers and people tweeting at me. But what was really touching was that there was this sort of huge appreciation of, thank you for putting this wonderful book into English so that I can read it, and a real joy that sort of, a lot of the barriers, the linguistic and cultural barriers, in Africa can sort of start perhaps to crumble because of translation. We can read each other, it's great. So that's very exciting.
Well, I think Tram 83 has certainly been a real success story in all sorts of ways. Obviously, you've had glowing reviews, you've had all this personal response from individual readers, and of course the aforementioned shortlist for the prizes. But how else do we define a successful translation? How do we know? How can we say that something we've done is a success? Gabby, how do you define it?
There's a number of measures of success that we track. I think the shortest answer is a combination of sales and positive feedback. So the positive feedback and sales sometimes are circular. It's hard to know which came first. But if you have a book that is meaty and that you know reviewers would be interested in, a strong publicity campaign with good results would be a definite success, even if sales didn't necessarily follow. A short list for an award is a measure of success. South Korean author Bae Sua's book, Nowhere to Be Found, was shortlisted for the BTBA this year, which we're very excited about, and it's meant that a number of people in this room have read that novel, which is tremendous. And it means that she also, as an author, has more of a platform than she had before. And that isn't necessarily something that's numeric. But we also have success through sales in any format. We have books that have been translated into other languages because people were able to read it in English, which I consider a huge success. And we've had authors find other channels. So authors whose platforms have been embellished by their existence in English, which doesn't necessarily show up as a success metric in English in terms of reviews or sales, but maybe that author got invited to hold an important position at a university, or maybe they've gotten an offer to do a new book that's different from the last one that their publisher wouldn't have considered doing had they not been sold into English. So I think there's a lot of ways to consider success. And for a translator, often success is succeeding in working together and producing a book we're both proud of and that the author can be proud of. And I think those private successes are the most rewarding for me on the day-to-day, when you have that feeling of having accomplished a hard problem, solving a hard problem together, having a disagreement about what to do with a problem, and then coming to terms and having a good solution that everyone's happy with. I think those small things actually are what make this work most rewarding.
Amy, how would you define a successful translation Turkish into English? What kind of things are you looking for?
I think that's a loaded question. I think in general, I mean, kind of have to talk about maybe accepted norms in translation in English, which means usually it means a fluid translation. But I think it's very difficult. I mean, just to kind of add to what Gabby was talking about, I mean, what I think Gabby was saying was a successful book. And sometimes you might have a very successful translation of a book that doesn't necessarily do well in the target language because of the book, not the translation. So I think it's, these two can sometimes be conflated. But I mean, it's difficult to judge, and I think a person who knows the source language and can, sits and compares, and depends on the relationship that they even have with the source language and how they judge the target translation. There are just so many variables that I'm really at a loss to answer the question in a way.
And for the online journals, obviously sales are not those of us who are online and available free and accessible to anyone with access to a computer. Obviously, we don't have sales figures. How do we define success? Leong?
I'll give a short answer. I think it's when the translator succeeds in reconstructing the voice. And it may not be the most obvious and most direct translation, but if it comes across as if it's entirely a voice, you know what I mean? It's coherent, and the prose lifts off the page or the screen at some point. I think that's when you can tell.
I think I could summarize it as the feel-good factor. I feel good when someone says, "Oh, I read that story, and I really liked it." Someone who'd never read any short stories from Chinese before. Also, the feel-good factor that comes when I'm working with an author and an editor and we come to happy solutions, ones that all of us are happy with. And those two, I think.
I think we can open the floor to questions now. Thank you to all the panelists.
Can I just say something very quickly? Because I'm very conscious of the fact that the work that we do is for free and is accessible to every one of you with an internet connection. So I try to take the opportunity to get as many new readers as possible. I'm going to ask my editor-at-large for London to distribute some brochures for those of you especially who haven't heard of the journal yet. So do check it out.
Questions?
I would like to ask a question specific about Chinese literature. So Nicky and Eileen mentioned topics are important. So about Chinese literature, what kind of topics would you try to promote to the English readers?
I don't think it's a matter of the topic. I think it's a well-rounded, exciting story, a story that's thought-provoking, a story that's beautifully written and beautifully translated. I did mention topics. I think what I meant was that when we have, say, 3 good stories, and one is a topic which fits with an item in the news, then we'll use it. And it can be a political thing, such as the end of the one-child policy, where we happen to have a story, but it can be a much more general topic like Chinese New Year, and that was my chance to get my favourite translation, an excerpt from online. So I think a topic is an aid, but it's not a crucial component. The story has to be good.
Sorry, just one more question. And would you consciously distinguish Chinese literature from mainland China or and Chinese literature overseas?
No, I wouldn't. We do publish stories written in Chinese from many different parts of the Chinese-speaking world.
Well, at Asymptote, we recently published a short story by Zhang Guixing. He's actually a Malaysian writer, but he's living in Taiwan. And we're very, as a Chinese myself, I'm very conscious of the fact that there are so many diasporic Chinese living all over the world. And we try to cover a broad range of writers. So not just from mainland China, although that's where a lot of the readers' interest is in because of China's dominance in the news and politically and economically. We also try to cover the writers in Malaysia and Taiwan and even in Singapore as well. So if you want to take a deeper look at Chinese literature, you should come visit our site.
Other questions? Yes.
As a translator, I'm not all that familiar with the marketing and publishing houses deciding how to discover stories and what's accessible. But as a translator, I am, I obviously hear a lot of talk and have been part of conversations about works that deserve to be translated. It's very often Turkish, for example, novels, and I imagine it's the same in some of these other parts of Asia and Africa, work that deserves it. And it seems to me that the reverse is not necessarily true, in that works that make the bestsellers list in the US are translated. It's not a question of deserving it. The assumption is that if it sells well in the US, it will sell elsewhere and there will be interest in it. And I was wondering if for those of you on the panel, is there a sort of the connection between bestseller lists, popular works in, for example, France or North Africa or China or Turkey, and works that end up actually getting translated? Is there a connection? Would you say?
I'm very tempted to say no. I think that, sure, there are some works which will be bestsellers in many different countries, but I think it's certainly true that a book that's a bestseller in its home country may not at all sell well.
This panel is the first time that I've even really heard reference to sales in the home country.
Right.
Because it's always critical acclaim.
I mean, I think it's certainly it's an important argument if you're trying to convince a publisher to buy a book, whether it's sold well or done well in its home country. Probably trying to get them to buy a book which hasn't done well at all would be a very, very hard sell. But I think I think it's hard to say that you could sort of guarantee with a high level of success that if it's done well in the home country, it's going to do well somewhere else. I may be completely wrong.
Yeah, I would just say that, well, for one, we should give Amazon Crossing some credit for breaking the mold of translated literature being highbrow, literary fiction across the board. But I think that, the comparison with the bestseller list in English being translated into other languages, that also just, it comes down to a dominant culture, obviously, to center versus periphery, and also just to the sheer number of translators available and what those translators are willing to be paid at the end of the day, and how much risk a publisher can take or is willing to take in the other direction. It's also you can completely see. Actually, it would be an interesting exercise maybe to look at which languages which languages get into which languages that are on bestseller lists, if that makes any sense. So translating into Turkish, a French book that makes the bestseller list is much more likely to get into Turkish than a Swedish book, obviously. And English is at the top of the list, and so it really just comes down kind of to the hierarchy of languages in terms of the number of translators at the end of the day, I think.
And I think also anytime you're talking about what gets into English, there is a lot of serendipity involved, but there's also a question of how books are represented, and more powerful publishers and more effective agents will be able to match their books with their opposite numbers in other countries. Sometimes, unfortunately, it is those works have done very well financially and are not necessarily the most literary, but they do often have the most support behind them, and that again is a business as opposed to a philosophical.
I would just add, too, that one of the things that I think is most helpful is an editorializing of the list. So when I talk to an agent or a translator in a market, one of the things I want to know is tell me what's doing well and why you think that is. Because in the US or any other market, a lot of what's doing well is very contextual. This is hot right now because of X reason. And that won't necessarily translate. But if it's hot right now because it's phenomenal and everyone is reading it because it's good, I get really interested. And what does that mean? Good could mean different things across marketplaces, but good is different from popular. And I think one of the hardest things that we're always trying to do is to distinguish those things. And we rely very much on people who read and who understand the culture that they're working from to help us see that. And also, if any of you are data scientists and you want to gather international bestseller lists and do the analysis that Amy recommended, I would love that.
I think we all would.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Okay, well, then we will have time to thank you for coming, and thank you to our panelists, Nicky Harman, Roland Glasser, Amy Spangler, Yulong Lee, and Gabby Pagefort, and Susan, I think I've been anonymous the whole time, Susan Harris from Words Without Borders.
And there's free books over here we would love to give you.
Yes, Amazon has free books from the regions that we've been talking about in the back for you to go fight over now.